Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and someone in this town is lying. And I know that's not a big breaking story. It's Washington, D.C. It's full of politicians. Everybody's lying. But the lies that are being told right now about the investigation into the Biden family's corruption, it could very well lead to the impeachment of the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, and the President of the United States, that would be Joseph Robinette Biden. In fact, Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy confirmed over the weekend that by next week he could proceed with impeachment for Attorney General Merrick Garland at least, and it's based on what we learned from those IRS whistleblowers last week. Now, I want to break this down for you because it's actually quite simple why Merrick Garland might be facing impeachment here. Now, if you go to other cable news networks, or if you read the New York Times, or if you listen to liberal radio, if that still exists, they're going to pretend that this is a very complicated, complex, hard to understand, confusing conspiracy theory these right-wingers have come up with. And they'll make it more complicated than it needs to be. But it isn't. It's actually quite simple. I'm going to lay it out for you. In fact, I'll say it simply. It's obstruction of justice. The Attorney General has said that nothing will impede the investigation of the Biden family, despite the fact that Mr. Biden is the President of the United States. But nope, if the U.S. Attorney sees a crime, he can bring charges. He's promised that. And now we have reason to believe that that was a lie. That, in fact, the U.S. Attorney looking into the Biden family's corruption and crimes was impeded. That's obstruction of justice. And also a cover-up. And, of course, it's obstruction of justice looking into a palpable crime. We know that there is a crime committed by Hunter Biden because he's already announced that he would plead guilty to 3 crimes. So you got your crime, you got your cover-up, you got your obstruction of justice. And that's how people get impeached in this town. It really is that simple. Now, let's begin with the whistleblower. This man, Gary Shapley. He is an agent for the IRS. Look at him. He's worked for years, over 2 decades, in the Internal Revenue Service as an investigator. His job is to find the bad guys, people who are cheating on their taxes. Now, he has every reason to keep his mouth shut. He has every reason not to stick his neck out. He has every reason not to blow that whistle that he has blown. But he has. Now, this man is David Weiss. He is the U.S. Attorney for the district in Delaware. He is the man who has been responsible for investigating the Biden family and potential tax crimes, as well as many other crimes that they may have committed. Now, David Weiss is on record saying that Merrick Garland has not impeded his investigation one iota. Here's a letter he sent earlier this month to the United States Congress. I want to make clear that, as the Attorney General has stated, I have been granted ultimate authority over this matter, including responsibility for deciding where, when, and whether to file charges and for making decisions necessary to preserve the integrity of the prosecution. There you go. That's under oath. All right? So, take for granted that he is telling the truth. And he's backed up by the Attorney General himself. Here he is, sworn testimony with Chuck Grassley in the United States Senate, again, just, I think, about 2 months ago. Watch.
The U.S. Attorney in Delaware has been advised that he has full authority to make those kind of referrals that you're talking about, or to bring cases in other jurisdictions if he feels it's necessary. And I will assure that if he does, he will be able to do that.
Does the Delaware U.S. Attorney lack independent charging authority over certain criminal allegations against the president's son outside of the District of Delaware?
He would have to bring, if it's in another district, he would have to bring the case in another district. But as I said, I have promised to ensure that he's able to carry out his investigation and that he be able to run it. And if he needs to bring it in another jurisdiction, he will have full authority to do that.
There you go. It's very clear, too. The questioning was specific. Can Mr. Weiss bring charges if he finds a crime was committed? Merrick Garland says absolutely. What if those crimes were committed in a district outside of Delaware, the District of Columbia, or maybe Southern California? Merrick Garland, he has our full support. He can bring those charges even if it's in another district. And David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, he backed him up in writing. Both of these men are now sworn under oath with their statements. nothing will impede this investigation. And that brings us back to Gary Shapley. He's the IRS whistleblower, which, remember, he has every reason not to blow that whistle. He has every reason to just keep his head down, finish out his career, collect his pension, maybe move to Florida where there aren't any state taxes. He knows better than anyone. He works for the IRS. But he didn't. He didn't. He actually stepped forward last week and he gave his testimony. And this is where things get dicey for Mr. Weiss. Let's bring up Mr. Weiss again. He's the U.S. Attorney in Delaware. And in October of last year, October 7th, 2022, Mr. Weiss had a meeting with senior level managers from the IRS, including Mr. Shapley, as well as investigators with the FBI and the Justice Department. At that meeting, Mr. Shapley and his colleagues at the IRS laid out exactly the criminal behavior that they had discovered committed by Hunter Biden and perhaps other members of the Biden family. And it was at that moment when Mr. Weiss, the U.S. Attorney of Delaware, in October of last year, apparently said that he was not the deciding official. He was not the deciding person on whether charges are filed. Shapley then commented that he believes this to be a huge problem inconsistent with the public position of Merrick Garland's testimony. Special Agent in charge of the FBI D.C. Field Office, Darrell Walden, was at that October 7th meeting. He got an email summary of the meeting from Mr. Shapley and said, "Thanks, Gary. You covered it all." That's according to great reporting from Margot Cleveland over at the Federalist. So at this meeting, Mr. Weiss says, I don't have control here. I can't bring the charges. I'm being blocked in D.C. I'm being blocked in Southern California. He also goes on in this meeting to say, I asked Merrick Garland for special counsel status so that I could be a special counsel and I wasn't impeded by anybody at Justice, and I was denied that status. Now, we know that that happened at that meeting on October 7th because Mr. Shapley, the whistleblower, he wrote an email, as I just mentioned, to all the people who were at that meeting except Mr. Weiss. And as you just saw, the one response he got from that email was, "Thanks, Gary, you covered it all." Nobody responded and said, "Wait a minute, I don't remember David Weiss saying all of that. That didn't happen." And that email was written the day of the meeting, not later. So somebody is lying. It's that simple. And it's obstruction of justice. You've got the Attorney General and you've got the U.S. Attorney, Mr. Weiss, who said that we can bring charges against anyone we want, and we will. And you've got this IRS investigator who has found real crimes committed by Hunter Biden, and he says that at a meeting, that very same Mr. Weiss said that he wasn't allowed to bring charges. Merrick Garland stopped him from doing so. So who's lying? The Attorney General, who has every reason to lie to help cover up for his boss, the president, and to cover up himself. Mr. Weiss, who once again is trying to make his boss happy and to cover up his own tracks. Or this IRS agent, who could have stayed anonymous for the rest of his life. We would have never known anything. I guess it's up for you to decide, and for me to decide, and perhaps the judiciary to decide. Should Speaker of the House McCarthy allow them to move forward on an impeachment investigation? That's the latest, and it's not complicated at all, is it? There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight. You're watching Salem News Channel. Well, as we just discussed, somebody is lying in this whole thing. It could be Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, or David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney in Delaware. Or it could be the IRS whistleblower, but one wonders why he would. He could have enjoyed his anonymity and not brought this upon himself. But if it is the Attorney General, then he should face impeachment charges. In fact, we've heard from Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy now saying that that's exactly the path that they're beginning to walk down. And if he does, it will be this man amongst the panel of congressmen in the Judiciary Committee who will weigh those impeachment charges. He is Representative Greg Steube of Florida, and he joins us now. Thanks for joining us tonight, Congressman.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm sure you've heard what the Speaker had to say about this, and do you agree that this rises to the level of impeachment for the Attorney General?
100%. I don't think this is the first time he's been dishonest with the American people. I've already signed on to an impeachment resolution for Merrick Garland, as well as Mayorkas, as well as Biden. They went after President Trump time and time again for nothing. and then they actually are the ones committing crimes and should absolutely be impeached. So Merrick Garland not only should be impeached, but he should be brought before the American people, brought before those committees and testified. So now that we have information from those whistleblower, lying to Congress is a crime. So he should be held accountable for the criminal activity of lying to Congress, if in fact he did that, which I believe he did based on the representations that were made.
Yeah, and again, somebody's lying. We have two different stories coming from three different people. It appears that U.S. Attorney David Weiss is backing up his boss, the Attorney General Merrick Garland. They both say that there's been nothing stopping Mr. Weiss from bringing charges should he have found any crimes to bring charges. That's sworn testimony, and now we have this sworn letter from the whistleblower. How exactly do you go about putting this together now?
Well, you have that testimony, and in that testimony, the whistleblower identified specific people in the DOJ who told him and who were stonewalling him, told him not to do subpoenas, not to do search warrants, wouldn't get approval for certain things. So those people we need to start bringing them in as a subpoena under oath, asking them questions under oath, because I believe those individuals, I think one of the names was Leslie Wolf,
Yes.
Those individuals obstructed justice, in my opinion. If they weren't allowing an investigation to move forward in a normal manner against the normal procedures that the FBI and the IRS has, and they were stonewalling that, not allowing for search warrants to be issued, coordinating with Hunter's counsel, a lot of very unsundrious things that, in my opinion, were obstructing the administration of justice on this case. We should start bringing those people in and questioning them as well. And I believe that the Ways and Means chairman, from my conversations with him, have intentions to do that.
I'm sure you saw the press briefing on Friday. It was extraordinary to actually see members of the White House press corps asking tough questions and sort of ganging up on Karine Jean-Pierre and Mr. Admiral Kirby. They kept referring all the reporters to the statement that the White House counsel put out. The statement from the White House counsel is extraordinary, Congressman Steube. They claim that, as we've always said, President Biden was not in business with his son. Is that what they've always been saying? That he wasn't in business with Hunter?
Well, you know, the story keeps changing. And of course, they're going to obstruct from the White House perspective, because the American people, and I was surprised, too, to see the level of now the mainstream media starting to talk about it, because there's so much information and facts out there now that they can't ignore it. And you have them trying to be like, oh, Hunter or President Biden had no knowledge of Hunter's business dealings, when in fact, in the whistleblower testimony, there are WhatsApp messages that were taken from search warrants that Hunter is talking to a Chinese Communist Party official saying, my father is sitting next to me, don't make me put him on the phone.
Yeah.
My father, X, Y, and Z is with me. And suddenly, you know, soon thereafter, they got their $5 million. You don't think that the president was involved in this? And now we have actual documented WhatsApp messages from Hunter Biden saying that his father was involved. I can't say, being a lawyer, I can't think of any stronger evidence on the issue than that.
And it seems like a pretty easy question to answer. Was the president sitting next to his son when that message was sent? We know what time it was sent. We know what day it was sent. Or was the president, was Hunter Biden lying? That's easy, but they refuse to answer that question.
Yeah, the White House refuses to answer that question because they don't want to, again, lie to the American people that then, through discovery of some of this other information, can shown to be completely and utterly false.
That's right.
This isn't over. The Ways and Means Committee is committed to continuing the IRS part of this investigation. The Oversight Committee is committed to the overall investigation, and the Judiciary Weaponization Committee, which I have the honor to serve on, is also having a piece of the judicial Merrick Garland side of this because of the complete weaponization and politicization of the Department of Justice and the FBI.
Listen, the entire conversation we've had so far is just shot through the lens of corruption, because it looks like really simple to explain corruption, too. A lot of money flowing in to 20 different shell corporations, favors exchanged for it, and then you've got obstruction and cover-up. That's good old-fashioned corruption in Washington. There's the other element of it, Congressman Steube, and that has to do with the two tiers of justice. That this sort of thing gets a slap on the wrist with Hunter Biden pleading out to misdemeanors, and yet look at how Republicans, conservatives are treated. Look at the President of the United States with these extraordinary, unprecedented charges brought against him, charges that have never been brought against a current candidate for president as he is. How do you address that aspect? And it's one thing to address the corruption and the high crimes and misdemeanors, but it's this deteriorating effect on the American public where they feel like there are two sets of rules. If we can't rely on our Justice Department, then we start to fall into anarchy, sir.
100% agree, and that's exactly the purpose of the Weaponization Committee that was created to investigate these type of things, bring it before the American people. And just think for a second, if we didn't have the majority in the House, none of this information that we just discussed would be before the American people. The Democratic majority in the House wouldn't investigate these things. So, but for Republicans having the majority and the ability to investigate these things and the avenue for whistleblowers to come forth and talk to us has given this information before the American people. And you're right, the politicization goes all the way to the top, and that's what we plan on bringing forth so the American people can see the complete differences between the two parties come 2024.
I'm sure you saw the image of Hunter Biden following his father up the steps of Marine One so they could get away for a weekend at Camp David. Are you concerned that they were really just trying to get their story straight and come up with their defense together?
Oh, it would not surprise me at all that type of activity is going on. Clearly, there's coordination between what Hunter Biden was doing and what was happening with Joe Biden's official activities. He was the liaison when he was vice president to the Ukraine. Suddenly, Hunter Biden's on a board over there making $80,000 a month and was doing other things in those countries. Vice President then Joe Biden was in charge of the Chinese Communist Party policy. Suddenly Hunter Biden's making tens of millions of dollars in relationships there. And we now have direct evidence of a message from Hunter to a Chinese Communist Party individual that he's sitting next to his father. I mean, the level now of evidence that we have to go after impeachment, to show the American people just how corrupt the Biden family is. Yeah. I don't think Watergate had this level of evidence.
I would have to agree with that. And the difference there, though, is that it seemed like President Nixon had some sense of shame, had some sense of awareness of how important. Yeah. What does it tell you that Joe Biden is so audacious and doesn't give a flip about the American people or appearances that he would invite Hunter Biden to a state dinner and let him hang out in a black tie with, other U.S. senators and then spend a weekend at Camp David? It's pretty audacious.
Well, and the step above that is these officials like Merrick Garland and others who are willing to risk going to jail for lying to Congress, all for Joe Biden. That's the piece of it I just don't understand at all why these other individuals, Merrick Garland, Weiss, are willing to completely put up their integrity, their career, and everything else. And thank the Lord we have people like this brave whistleblower who are willing to come forward and say, okay, enough is enough. Look at the complete miscarriage of justice that's going on in the IRS.
Yeah, well, one last thing, we only have 30 seconds, but it was striking to me that every single Democrat in the Ways and Means Committee wanted to silence this information. They voted no against releasing the whistleblowers' information. Are you concerned that the Democrats are going to try to drag their feet and obstruct your efforts in the House? Or do you think maybe at least one of them might step up and say, yeah, this is a problem?
Yeah, suddenly Democrats don't like whistleblowers, yet when they were investigating President Trump, they love whistleblowers. And suddenly now they don't want the information through a congressional committee that was brought to us by an official whistleblower to be made out for the American people. I was shocked that not a single Democrat wanted that information to be out there in the American public.
Yeah, well, listen, I will join you in thanking God we at the very least have that 4 or 5 seat majority in the House. All we needed was the one to be able to control these investigations, and I'm glad you're in the majority, Congressman Steube. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight. America just acknowledged the 1-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, which struck down Roe v. Wade after 49 excruciating years. We acknowledged it. Some of us celebrated it. I celebrated it. It was also a reminder that this is the week. This is the week where the biggest Supreme Court decisions that have been made in this session will be released. And if you're a Supreme Court watcher, today is sort of the last calm day before a very hectic week. So we're happy to grab Carrie Severino, president of Judicial Crisis Network, who is a Supreme Court watcher. And I know that you're waiting every day around 10 a.m. You're just, okay, what do we got? And it looks like we're going to wait. But what are you waiting for in particular here, Carrie?
Well, there are a few big cases coming down, a couple that touch on education, the Harvard and UNC cases that have to do with whether those schools, a public school and one that receives public funding, should be allowed to discriminate in admissions on the base and race in the basis of their admissions. So obviously discriminating in favor of one race means discriminating against other races. And so that they're going to decide that. President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan that kind of try to shoehorn his policy goals into a law that was never designed for that. The Supreme Court's going to weigh in on that. And then 2 cases on religious freedom. One having to do with Lori Smith, a web designer who wants to be able to do custom designs for wedding websites, but doesn't want to be forced to do that for weddings that she has a religious opposition to. And then also DeGraff versus Joy, which deals with a postal worker who chose that job because he has a religious belief that he should not work on Sundays, but now is being forced to by the post office as they're starting to expand to Sunday deliveries. They're refusing to give him a religious exemption to not have to violate his conscience.
Okay, so those are the big 4 coming down the pike. And based on everyone's reaction after these arguments were first made months ago, it's such a maddening process to have these first in the news several months ago, 6 months ago, 7 months ago, and then now having to wait for these decisions. But most observers thought that the 6-3 conservative ratioed court pretty much fell down on the conservative side of all 4 of those big issues. Are you in that camp, or are you sort of shaken up over the racial districting case that came down 2 weeks ago?
Well, I definitely was very disappointed in that case. In that case, the court followed a precedent that I think everyone recognized was not great precedent to force Alabama to consider race in districting when that's really should be exactly what we're doing, not doing, off the table, right? So I was disappointed in that. That said, this court has long been very protective of religious freedom. In 2 of those cases, as I said, religious freedom cases, I'm optimistic about that. And with respect to racial preferences in education, this is something that the Chief Justice in particular has been very eloquent about. He said the best way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And I would hope he'd be consistent there. In terms of the student loan case, well, the court seemed overwhelmingly clear that what President Biden's attempting to do here is not lawful. There is still the open question whether they will agree that the people bringing this particular case and this particular round of litigation are the right parties. But I think whether they address it this year or whether it comes up in a future year with different litigants, it's clear that President Biden's plan absolutely has no constitutional or legal basis.
I'm interested, do you think it's possible that the courts could split the difference on the racial admissions college based on the private institution versus a public institution?
I think it would be hard for them to do that. Frankly, just if you said people receiving federal funding have to not discriminate, that already covers a huge number of almost every university in the country.
That's true.
They've tried splitting the baby on this issue before, and in my opinion, it's never really gone well. You've just had universities trying to game the system and continue what they're doing, maybe with slightly more subtle ways of doing it. I hope the Supreme Court just says, you know what, for once and for all, let's make this clear. No one should be discriminating on the basis of someone's skin color to let them in or out, whether they think they're helping one person or another. They're hurting other groups. Asian Americans have a very difficult time here, and I think they haven't been heard from as much in these issues and considered. I'm glad they're finally having a voice in this case.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. The actual plaintiffs in both of these discrimination cases are Asian Americans who are being discriminated against because it's claimed that they're overrepresented, which means, they've worked their tails off and they've qualified, but solely because of their racial makeup, they're denied entry. There's also public secondary schools, one famously here in Fairfax, Virginia, in Northern Virginia, a DC suburb, Thomas Jefferson High School. They've sort of adopted policies like this. Could this decision actually trickle down into high schools and secondary schools around the country as well?
Absolutely. In Virginia, what they did is they saw the writing on the wall. So they tried to reverse engineer another process to get what they wanted, which is fewer Asians at the school. But they didn't do it through explicitly racial means. But, our country has dealt with those kinds of things before. And after Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment says that blacks have the right to vote. But there were people who tried workarounds. They had grandfather clauses. They had poll taxes, whatever they could do to try to engineer that result without mentioning race out and out. We know that is not permissible either. And so I hope that, after this case, it'll probably have to trickle down for a while. But if Thomas Jefferson keeps on attempting to make an end run around this system, I hope the Supreme Court gives them a clear answer that that's not allowed either.
It's just so mind-boggling and jarring to the ear to hear you say, and it's the fact to state that their goal was to have fewer Asians at the school, and they found a workaround. And by the way, the group that benefited the most from the anti-Asian sentiment at Fairfax County's Thomas Jefferson High School were white kids. It's all these white liberals clutching Ibram X. Kendi's book, claiming that they want equity, and it's really helping their kids out and hurting the Asian kids. It's maddening.
Yeah, it's shocking to see this level of racism that, they're not calling it that. They're trying to say we're being positive to other races. But, Harvard in particular, which is one of the litigants in this case, has a long record of this. Earlier in the 20th century, they were doing the same thing. At the time, it was really anti-Semitism that was driving it. But they have a very long and very ugly record of trying to find a workaround to eliminate groups that they feel like, we don't need any more of that type of person in our school.
Justice Samuel Alito wrote the Dobbs decision, as I mentioned at the beginning of this segment. We're acknowledging and celebrating, the one-year anniversary of this remarkable decision. There has been just a full court attack on this man's integrity. Personally, all of these so-called investigative pieces showing some level of corruption or improper financial dealings, none of it has stuck, but Carrie, I'd love for you to comment on how they've targeted this man because of this decision and have made his life hell this year.
Absolutely. This is what's really going on, as you correctly identify, is not that Justice Alito has done anything differently than any of the other justices, or that he's done anything incorrect. Nothing they've even alleged. It violates any rule, violates the court's ethics procedures, which, there's also this fake idea going around the court doesn't follow any ethics rules. It absolutely does. It has disclosure requirements. It has recusal requirements. It follows them. They're trying to create a new standard. And then they're trying to selectively apply it to conservative justices. So it's Justice Alito. They've gone after Justice Thomas. There was a recent, laughably insane piece about Justice Barrett complaining that, of course, she sold her house because she had to move to D.C. and claiming that she sold it to a religious freedom group, which wasn't even true. This is really outrageous behavior on the part of the left. And a lot of it is just trying to create the impression of ethical problems that don't exist at all, because they're trying to provide fuel for Democrats in Congress who are hoping that they can legislate some way that they will have more control over the court. They would love a thumb on the scale of who gets to sit on which case, because as Justice Breyer, even a liberal justice, pointed out, that is a real risk when people are trying to get someone recused off a case at the Supreme Court. We all know, it's going to be a difference if you get Justice Kagan recused or Justice Sotomayor recused versus Justice Thomas or Justice Alito recused. And so there's all this strategic behavior to invent faux scandals in order to get your opponents off the bench.
Meanwhile, here we are over a year later, and we still don't know who leaked this decision, which is probably one of the most deteriorating actions in the Supreme Court in the past several decades. Will we ever know precisely who did this?
At this point, I don't think we will know any time in the near future. I've often said we'll probably find out about the leaker when they get a book deal and try to go for a New York Times bestseller with a tell-all about it. At this point, it was so unsuccessful, I almost wonder whether they've blown their chance at that. I think we may have to wait until some of the internal records of the court are disclosed, and that could be decades. I am heartened by the fact that was such an unpopular move that it has not yet been repeated. I hope that the court can regain the internal trust and confidence between the clerks and the justices after that just immense act of betrayal.
Well, Carrie Severino, happy Dobbs anniversary, and take a deep breath and get ready. The next 4 days are going to be go time, and I know you're going to be very busy. Appreciate you carving out some time for us tonight. More to come on O'Connor Tonight. Well, Friday night we had a coup of sorts in Russia, but it wasn't. But everyone said it was, but then it wasn't. And it sort of petered out, and now we're not sure what's going on there. And does it weaken Putin? Does it strengthen Putin? Does it show he's vulnerable, or does it show he's invulnerable? Take your pick. You'll find people taking all sides of this discussion. But let's talk to somebody who might know a little bit more than your average bear. She's the Vice President of Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at Heritage, and she was the former Deputy National Security Advisor under Robert O'Brien in the Trump administration. Victoria Coates, thanks for joining us, Victoria.
Thank you for having me, Larry.
Well, all right, you heard me set it up. I mean, I'm hearing people say this shows that Putin is weak, and other people say this strengthens Putin's hand. What's really going on?
Yeah, I think anybody who tells you they know what's going on right now who is not named Yevgeny Prigozhin or Vladimir Putin is lying to you.
You know what? I really, really appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
No, I mean, it's the number of people who claim to have inner knowledge of this is really remarkable. And I think, what it does demonstrate to me is Putin has successfully, over the last 2+ decades, managed security in Russia by pitting elements within his own Ministry of Defense, but then these external elements like Wagner or the Chechen militias, basically pitting them against each other. So none of them get too powerful and he can retain control. Now, the problem with that is eventually one of your pet scorpions tries to take out the other pet scorpion, and then you have a real problem on your hands, which is what I think erupted over the weekend.
Yeah, and listen, I have no love for Vladimir Putin, and if he were toppled, that would be fantastic. But when you learn about who the Wagner Group is and the kind of stuff that they've been involved in, there's no good guys over there, is there?
No, not at all. And one always has to be concerned about a worse monster, that in many ways Wagner is worse than the Russian Ministry of Defense. And of course, that's a pretty high bar, but they seem to be right up there on it. So I think particularly given the fact that Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, we have to be concerned about destabilizing Russia. And we cannot assume after what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall that democracy and capitalism will be embraced in Russia, with parades and flowers. It's just simply not the case. So if we don't want a bunch of dysfunctional little Russian breakaway states, each with their nuclear arsenal, we have to watch this extremely carefully and not be sort of carried away with romantic ideals of what might be possible in Russia.
What was more surprising to you, Victoria Coates, that the Wagner Group could actually mobilize and appear to make some inroads into some outlying towns on their way to Moscow? Or was it more surprising that Vladimir Putin was able to clamp down so quickly and so effectively?
I think the original incursion back into Russia was probably the most surprising. And, we still don't have confirmation of a lot of what was reported in terms of things being shot down. It isn't clear what actually happened. And then Prigozhin just resurfaced a little bit before we've been talking with an audio tape saying that he was never going to try to upset the Russian government. He was only protesting the conduct of the war in Ukraine and what he saw as a disproportionate burden being placed on his forces. And it'll be very interesting to see what Putin, who we have not yet heard from post-truce, what he says in response. Because if his promise to not bring charges against Prigozhin holds, it suggests that they might have been a little bit more coordinated in this episode than we know right now.
Do you think this will affect Vladimir Putin's approach and strategy to the Ukrainian war effort? Will this give him pause in terms of continuing down the path that he's been? Or will it actually potentially make him double down and be that much more ruthless?
Well, this is going to be one of the critical questions, but one thing I want to encourage all your viewers to do is not get too tied up with Ukraine. Obviously, this is the most famous engagement of the Wagner forces. They have in many ways been critical in what success Russia has had in Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainians have been saying the right things about looking at this carefully and potentially pressing an advantage for them, which they should do. But this is far from the only place that Wagner is deployed. We have them in Libya, Sudan, Mali, Syria, all of the garden destinations throughout the Middle East and Africa, but then also in Venezuela. They're in our own hemisphere, and they were instrumental in putting down the protests against their dictator Maduro in 2019. So if this is one of the sort of tools Putin has been using to mess with our own hemisphere, if they are disrupted, this could be a real opportunity for us.
So that's actually quite chilling as well. And is the Wagner Group, I mean, how would you describe them in terms of something analogous to the West? Are they off books military? Is it like a private mercenary force at the whim of the president? Do the taxpayers of Russia actually pay for them? Should I give you more multiple choice questions? Who are these guys?
Well, yeah, tax revenues isn't really the way Russia finances anything. It's more a graft and exploitation system. But yes, I mean, they're more like a militia. If you think about the groups that, say, the Iranians deploy, Hamas, Hezbollah, throughout the Middle East, kind of do their bidding. It's more along those lines.
Well, those are all, we categorize them as terrorist groups. Would it be appropriate to sort of thumbnail Wagner Group as a terrorist organization?
You know, this is something we've looked at. We looked at it in the Trump administration because their behavior is pretty atrocious. And, you know, if you look at what they've done, you know, in Ukraine, in Africa, you know, it's torture, it's serial rape, you know, just execution style murders. And so, you know, these are not a group of freedom fighting angels. And I certainly think, you know, that reality needs to be brought home to folks that, you know, despite the kind of romantic view of this dash to Moscow, these are absolutely not the people you want to put in charge. They're very, very dangerous.
A few years ago, you worked in the White House in a national security capacity. I've learned more and heard more concise, cohesive explanation of what's going on here from you in the last 8 minutes than we did all weekend long from anybody from the Biden administration. Was it a mistaken opportunity for somebody from this White House to come out and sort of explain to the American people what was happening?
Well, it was certainly very timid, and apparently their explanation is they didn't want to be accused by the Russians of meddling. Well, I can tell you one thing that for sure, which is the United States will be accused of meddling. So trying to avoid that is, you know, you're baking failure into your approach. And I think that we really could have used hearing from the commander in chief, particularly about the nuclear weapon issue, the visual of the Secretary of State convening a series of European foreign ministers was not exactly the sign of strength that I think we all could have used.
Yeah.
And you know, the you know, cancellation of the Pentagon trip to Israel, it seems completely unnecessary at this point. Like they didn't really know what was going on. So yeah, I think they could have been a lot more forward-leaning, particularly if this is a case where Russia is you know, on less sure footing.
Yeah, and they hardly projected the steady hand, at least from where I was sitting. Real fast, we only have about half a minute left, but I just want to clear this up. Does the Wagner Group actually have at their disposal nuclear weapons of any sort?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
That would really surprise me. That's held by the Ministry of Defense. Now, you know, that said, in the breakdown of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of small tactical nukes that were floating around. We now have them in Belarus. So you can't say for sure, and we should watch that too.
All right, Victoria Coach, we'll leave it there, but great stuff. And congratulations on the new gig there at Heritage Foundation. We look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, Larry.
There's more to come on O'Connor tonight. You are watching the Salem News Channel. We've been talking for quite some time here on the program about ESG standards and how they've infiltrated corporate America. ESG, that's environmental, social, and government protocols. It's the kind of thing that big investors or board members, they get onto a board and they force companies to do something stupid, like bringing in Dylan Mulvaney to sell their beer, that kind of thing. And because a lot of us have been shedding some light on it, well, apparently things are starting to look bad for some of the people who have been pushing it harder than anyone else. In fact, one of our favorite guests to discuss this issue is Will Hild. He's the Executive Director of Consumers Research. And boy, I think you're in Larry Fink's head here, Will Hild, because he sort of blinked this weekend talking about ESG. What's this news?
Well, he was out in Colorado at the Aspen Institute giving an interview, and Axios reports that during that he said that he was ashamed to have been added to this political debate and that he is going to retreat from using this term ESG.
Okay, yeah, change the term, but you still have the same policy, right? And let's just be clear, Larry Fink is the guy in charge of BlackRock, which, as you've said on this program multiple times, they're sort of the chief offender of pushing these policies into corporations against really the people who own the company, the people who run the company, against their will, and certainly against the will of the consumers.
That's 100% correct. BlackRock is both the largest and the worst offender in this area. Larry Fink, just as of recently, was bragging about all the things he was able to push through at the corporate level, using other people's money. This is state, local, and federal pension funds that he manages. So he's able to use other people's money to push his political agenda. And up until recently, he was bragging about it. But now that he's been called out and caught red-handed, suddenly he's ashamed.
Yeah, and he blames Ron DeSantis, actually, for sullying the good name of ESG standards. And what Ron DeSantis did as the governor of Florida was to pull that state's pension funds and other investment funds out of companies that force these things, right?
It's 100% correct. It's almost like the old Scooby-Doo line. I'd have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you meddling governors. Because across the country, we've seen state officials, treasurers, attorney generals, and governors pushing back on having their own state's money be used against their political and economic interests. And Larry's complaining about this as if they don't have a right to have their money be used in a way that supports their politics and their interests and their voters.
And this is a great example of Governor DeSantis working with his legislature to actually, know what kind of power he has as governor and actually make a difference with it. I mean, here we got Larry Fink running and hiding. Although, let's be clear, he's not changing his policy. He's not changing his approach with the businesses that he's involved with. He's just, changing the brand name?
That's exactly right. I'll believe it when I see it. BlackRock's and Larry Fink's strategy this entire time, since we launched our media volley on them in October of 21, has been to talk out of both sides of their mouth. They try to hire up renter Republicans to go to Republican legislatures and state officials and say, hey, we're investing tons and tons of money in the fossil fuel industry. Back off. This is all much ado about nothing. On the left, though, they brag about all the things they're making those fossil fuel companies and other companies do by using those shares that they've purchased. So it's more par for the course. Larry couldn't even keep his story straight in that exact same interview. Later in the interview, he claimed that he'd never said that he was ashamed to use ESG. He'd said it 10 minutes prior.
He literally said those words.
Pretty par for the course with them. We have to focus on their actions and making them change their behavior.
Right. It's all these school boards saying, no, we're not utilizing critical race theory in our curriculum. But then when you look at the curriculum, it's clearly critical race theory. They're just not calling it critical race theory. So ESG is still there. Also, I want to be encouraged by this. It shows that we've got their attention, Will. But, Florida pulled $2 billion out of BlackRock investments because of this. They reported $200 billion in cash investments from U.S. customers last year. So that's literally just 1%. It's nothing for them.
Well, Larry likes to talk that up because he shows this tiny number being divested and this huge number being inflowed. That's a snapshot. What he doesn't like to talk about are the trend lines. The amount of money being divested from BlackRock has been going up exponentially year over year, while the amount of inflows has been going down. And you don't just have to take my word for it. No less than UBS Bank actually downgraded BlackRock's stock last year from a buy to a hold, citing the anti-ESG backlash. So it is having a measurable impact on their operation.
All right. Will Hild with the Consumers Research. Thanks for joining. You were the first person that ever mentioned Larry Fink, BlackRock, and ESG that I had taken note of, and you're still beating the drum, and I appreciate it. Thanks for your great work.
Thanks for having me on.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, I'll see you on the radio.